time for the secondary presentation. So this is something Kimberly asked me to talk about. Well, I'm sorry, I appear to have confused things. Duplicate. Keep. Okay. All right, we'll go with that. So one question that a lot of folks have who are potentially even experienced software developers or newer software developers, folks that are coming from a different ecosystem is, what's .NET and how does it relate to C#? We're here at the OKC meetup, and I spent a bunch of time talking about .NET and a teeny bit of time mentioning that one of the pieces that I was talking about was the C# compiler. So what is the difference? So again, I'm Rainer. I'm a dev at Microsoft in the developer division. We work on .NET and a bunch of other tooling type things like Visual Studio, and Visual Studio Code also lives in that division. So when you want to run a program, you're running on a computer that's running an operating system generally. That has hardware, there's direct memory, and computers run machine code. Machine code is famously unreadable. It's hard to tell what's going on. So people like to write programs in other languages. Like you might write JavaScript, and then that JavaScript needs something that can understand the JavaScript and also talk to the computer. And for web development, that something is part of the browser. The browser understands JavaScript and then turns it into computer code and runs that computer code. A lot of programs are written with compiled code using languages like C, C++, Rust, things like that. Those are compiled directly into machine code from at a build time. So you start with code, and then you run a program that produces an output file. That output file then runs directly on a computer. Another way you can write JavaScript is you write a JavaScript program that runs on the Node.js runtime. In that case, there's a different program that sits between your JavaScript and the machine and interprets the JavaScript and makes it compatible with the machine. So that's all background. Where does C# and .NET fit in? The answer is that C# is a programming language like JavaScript. You write a program in C#. But then when you run the compiler on that, when you build that C# program, the output is not something that the hardware directly understands, as it is when you have compiled code. But it is something that a piece of code that is part of the .NET framework called the Common Language Runtime, or CLR, understands. So what exactly does that mean? It means that there are other things that can produce code that runs in .NET. Visual Basic is an example of that. Visual Basic is another .NET language, compiles to the similar outputs, and runs on the Common Language Runtime. So the Common Language Runtime is a piece of code that runs binaries that are in a format called Microsoft's Intermediate Language, IL. The actual program of the CLR that lives in Microsoft or github.com/.net/core CLR is a program that has a few different pieces. It has what's called a JIT compiler, a just-in-time compiler, and it has a garbage collector, and it has all of the glue needed to take a program that is in IL and run it on your computer. So what's IL? IL is a format that the runtime uses. It's a binary format, so if you were to open up a .exe that was built with C# in Notepad or your favorite text editor, it's going to look like a bunch of garbage because it is. It's a binary format. But there is a nice textual output format. And when I say nice, I mean it looks like this. This is a method that I'm about to show you that does something very simple. It has two arguments. It takes a number and it takes another number. It adds those numbers together and it prints out the sum. So here's the code for that. This code has a lot of nice properties, but readability, understandability, debuggability, maintainability, ease of use, it's not any of those properties. The properties that it does have is it's easy for a computer to take this code and transform it into code that runs directly on computer hardware using that just-in-time compilation process. And that's awesome, and that's like a critical piece of why C# code can be performant and fast is because it can take this code and do a lot of borderline magical transformations on it. But you don't want to write this code. So we write in a variety of different .NET languages. So I'm going to show 3 today. Here's an implementation of that function in C#. So it looks kind of, sort of like JavaScript if you squint. That's because they're derived from the Algol family of languages that use curly braces. It's a lot easier to understand this. It takes arguments, it creates a sum, and then it writes that sum. Fascinating. I don't know how to fix that. Let's try. This is now the 3rd time I've told Windows to duplicate these displays. Okay. Here, this code is a little more readable than that IL. But this isn't the only way to do this. You could also use the language Visual Basic. And in that case, the code looks a little like this. No curly braces. Some of the keywords are a little different. But you can express your intent in the same kind of way. So anything that compiles to IL can run on the .NET framework. Visual Basic and C# are the usual common ways to do that, but there's several other languages that do it. One of the kind of up-and-coming ones is called F#. Here's an example of F# doing that I didn't finish before I started the presentation. Here's the same code in F#. This is a more functional language. It looks a little different, but it produces very similar code. And a big advantage of no, not that one. Please hold for technical difficulties. Sure. All right, so a big advantage of using the CLR is that you can use libraries, so you can use somebody else's functions that were written in any of those languages. And that allows the Visual Basic developers to use languages that were written in C#. It allows C# developers to use libraries that were written in VB. It allows F# to interoperate. All of that kind of works. So you can get useful functionality in any .NET language by tapping into other libraries that people have written in other languages. In the .NET ecosystem, NuGet is a package manager that allows you to find and use useful snippets of library code like that. If you're from JavaScript land, it's kind of like NPM. So what is .NET? .NET can refer to all of these things. Generally, it's MSIL and those kind of binaries, plus the CLR, that's the .NET Framework Runtime, plus libraries that we know everyone's going to need, things like lists, things like printing to the screen, things like serving an HTTP connection. All of those are kind of baked into the core of .NET. Plus, people talk about like the .NET ecosystem, which is all of the stuff around all of that. The tools that use it, the folks in this room who develop for .NET languages and that sort of thing. So So that's that. Thanks for coming out, folks.